Deep in the Tennessee mountains of 1887, where winter fog clings to ancient peaks and isolation breeds secrets darker than the mountain shadows, two 17-year-old twins orchestrated a revenge so methodical, so surgically precise, that seasoned lawmen refused to speak of it for decades. The story I'm about to tell you begins in Cove Creek Valley, where a mother and her own son created something that defied both nature and God's law. But what investigators discovered, locked away in a reinforced corncrib behind their cabin, revealed a horror far beyond the bloody scene inside their home. These weren't ordinary victims. These weren't ordinary killers. For 5 years, two brilliant minds trapped in damaged bodies studied, planned, and waited for the perfect moment to deliver justice that the law had failed to provide. What drove them to such calculated revenge? How did they acquire the anatomical knowledge to execute their plan with surgical precision? And what evidence was so disturbing that authorities sealed the case files for generations? What you're about to discover will test your understanding of justice itself, because sometimes the line between victim and perpetrator disappears entirely. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and if you're brave enough for this journey. Subscribe so you don't miss stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. December 21st, 1887, brought the kind of bitter cold that froze spit before it hit the ground in Cove Creek Valley, Tennessee. When neighbor Ezra McCallum trudged through knee-deep snow to check on the reclusive Thorne family, he expected to find Delilah and her son Obadiah huddled around their wood stove, perhaps short on supplies, but alive. Instead, he discovered two bodies, frozen solid in their one-room cabin, throats opened with cuts so precise they appeared almost surgical. The blood had crystallized into dark pools around their heads, and the silence that greeted McCallum was absolute, unnatural, wrong in a way that made his skin crawl even in the sub-zero temperatures. Sheriff Cornelius Whitlock arrived 3 hours later with a local constable, expecting a straightforward mountain murder case, probably over money or moonshine. But Whitlock's 15 years of law enforcement and his military training during the Civil War had taught him to notice details others missed. The cuts across both victims' throats were identical in depth and angle, executed with anatomical precision that suggested medical knowledge far beyond what typical mountain folk possessed. Even more disturbing, both victims appeared to have been killed while they slept, with no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication they had even awakened before their throats were opened. Whitlock's preliminary notes, preserved in Sevier County records, described the scene as methodically executed with surgical skill, suggesting premeditation and anatomical study. The constable was ready to declare it a case of outside intruders, but Whitlock's investigation had barely begun. As he documented the crime scene, he noticed something that made his blood run cold despite his years of experience with mountain violence. Both victims were found in their night clothes, positioned naturally in their beds as if they had died peacefully in their sleep. Yet the precision of their wounds suggested their killer had studied human anatomy extensively. More troubling still, Whitlock found fresh scratches around the doorframe and muddy footprints leading from the cabin to a large, heavily padlocked corncrib behind the house. The scratches were made from the inside, as if someone had clawed desperately at the wood, and the footprints were small, almost childlike, but led directly back to the corncrib where strange sounds were emanating from within. Whitlock's military instincts told him this was no ordinary murder scene. The killer possessed medical knowledge, had intimate access to the victims, and was still somewhere on the property. As he approached the corncrib, he could hear what sounded like whispered voices and intermittent scratching noises coming from inside the heavily chained structure. The building itself was unusual, reinforced with extra planking, and secured with multiple heavy padlocks that were clearly designed to keep something inside rather than intruders out. Whitlock's notes describe hearing articulate speech patterns and what appeared to be coherent conversation from within the locked building, though he could not make out specific words. The local constable suggested wild animals might have taken shelter there, but animals don't whisper to each other in what sounded distinctly like human voices. When Whitlock questioned McCallum about the Thorne family's habits, the neighbor revealed disturbing patterns that had developed over the past several years. The family had become increasingly reclusive after 1875, refusing visitors and declining offers of help during harsh winters. Most troubling, McCallum remembered Delilah giving birth to twins in 1870, but the children had seemingly disappeared after reaching their early teens. When pressed for details, McCallum admitted he had occasionally heard what sounded like children's voices from the property during his rare visits, but Delilah had always claimed he was hearing angels singing during their religious observances. The neighbor's testimony, recorded in Whitlock's careful handwriting, noted that the voices had grown more adult-sounding in recent years, though they were never seen and rarely heard except during winter months when sound carried further in the cold air. Whitlock's investigation took a darker turn when he examined local church records and discovered that Obadiah Thorne was registered as Delilah's son, not her husband, as neighbors had assumed. Birth records showed Obadiah born in 1862 to Delilah and her deceased husband Jeremiah, making the family dynamic far more disturbing than anyone had realized. Further examination of Delilah's body by traveling physician Dr. Marcus Henley revealed physical evidence that she had given birth recently, within the past few months, yet no infant was found anywhere on the property. The medical examination also confirmed that both victims had been killed by someone with extensive anatomical knowledge, as the cuts had severed specific arteries with surgical precision that would have caused rapid, silent death. As darkness fell on that December evening, Whitlock faced an unprecedented situation in his law enforcement career. 2 people were dead, killed with medical precision by someone who clearly knew them intimately. Strange voices continued to emanate from the locked corncrib, and mounting evidence suggested the Thorne family had been hiding secrets that defied explanation. The sheriff's detailed notes conclude that first day with an ominous observation that would prove prophetic. Whatever truth lies locked in that corncrib will test every assumption about justice, family, and the depths of human depravity. January 3, 1888, marked the day Sheriff Whitlock could no longer ignore the voices emanating from the Thorne family's reinforced corncrib. Armed with bolt cutters and accompanied by Dr. Henley and 2 deputies, Whitlock approached the heavily chained structure with growing dread about what 17 years of law enforcement had not prepared him to discover. The multiple padlocks and reinforced planking suggested this building had been designed as a prison rather than storage, and the scratching sounds that had continued through 2 weeks of investigation were growing more urgent, more desperate. When Whitlock called out that he was a sheriff, 2 distinct voices responded from within, articulate and calm, asking if he had come to arrest them for murder. The first chain fell away with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through the mountain valley, followed by the second, then the third, each padlock revealing the methodical security measures someone had taken to keep whatever was inside completely isolated from the outside world. When Whitlock finally pried open the heavy wooden door, the smell that escaped was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else that Dr. Henley would later identify as infection from untreated wounds. But what struck the sheriff first was not the odor, but the 2 pairs of intelligent eyes that stared back at him from the darkness, belonging to faces that were unmistakably human, yet distorted in ways that made his stomach lurch with recognition of what inbreeding could produce. Ezekiel and Naomi Thorne, 17 years old, according to their calm testimony, emerged from 5 years of imprisonment in conditions that would have driven most people insane. Ezekiel's left arm was withered and useless, his face marked by pronounced asymmetry that spoke of genetic damage, while Naomi's severe spinal curvature had left her barely 4 feet tall despite her age. Yet both twins spoke with remarkable intelligence and composure, immediately asking if Sheriff Whitlock had found their parents' bodies and whether he understood why they had been killed. Their articulate speech and logical thought processes were so incongruous with their physical appearance and living conditions that Dr. Henley would later write in his medical report that he had never encountered such a disturbing combination of physical deformity and mental acuity. The interior of the Corncrib revealed evidence that would haunt investigators for decades. Scratch marks covered every surface where fingernails had clawed at wood, creating a desperate record of years spent trying to escape. Makeshift bedding constructed from stolen rags and animal skins lay in one corner, while the opposite wall was covered in what appeared to be anatomical drawings scratched into the wood with sharp stones. Dr. Henley's examination of these crude illustrations revealed detailed knowledge of human throat anatomy, including precise locations of major arteries and the exact angles needed to sever them quickly. The twins had somehow acquired medical knowledge that enabled them to plan their parents' murders with surgical precision, despite being imprisoned since age 12 with no formal education. Naomi produced a bundle of papers from beneath their makeshift bedding, pages that had been carefully hidden and preserved despite years of captivity. These documents, written in Delilah's handwriting, formed a journal that would become crucial evidence in understanding the full scope of the family's depravity. The journal entries, written in a personal cipher that the twins had learned to decode during their imprisonment, documented Delilah's belief that producing children through incest with her own son was part of a divine test ordained by God. Entry after entry revealed her conviction that marked children born from such unions would prove her family's special covenant with the divine, justifying years of abuse as religious duty rather than criminal behavior. The twins' confession, recorded in Whitlock's meticulous handwriting, revealed a level of premeditation that shocked even experienced lawmen. They calmly explained how they had convinced their mother that their nighttime conversations were speaking in tongues during religious seizures, when they were actually planning murder in a coded language they had developed during captivity. For 3 years, they had studied anatomy using pages from Delilah's midwife books that she occasionally brought them, practicing precise cutting techniques on small animals they caught through gaps in the corncrib walls. Their confession detailed how they had convinced Delilah to unchain them one December night by pretending to have simultaneous religious seizures, then executed both parents while they slept. Dr. Henley's medical examination confirmed the genetic damage caused by inbreeding, documenting deformities that proved these children were the product of incest between Delilah and her own son Obadiah. His report, preserved in Tennessee State Archives, describes developmental abnormalities consistent with close genetic relationship between parents, while noting that despite severe physical damage, both twins demonstrated superior intelligence and remarkable emotional control. The medical evidence established beyond doubt that Delilah had indeed produced children through incest, then imprisoned them when their deformities became too obvious to hide from the community. Physical evidence found in the corncrib included anatomical drawings showing precise throat-cutting techniques, detailed plans for escape that had never been attempted, and, most disturbing of all, a carefully maintained calendar scratched into the wood that marked every day of their 5-year imprisonment. The twins had counted 1,826 days of captivity, during which they had planned and executed the perfect revenge against their tormentors. Their methodical documentation of time and anatomical study proved that despite their youth and isolation, they had maintained both sanity and determination throughout years of unimaginable abuse. February 7, 1888, brought the discovery that would transform a disturbing double murder into one of the most horrific family abuse cases in Tennessee legal history. Sheriff Whitlock's systematic search of the Thorne property, guided by the twins' increasingly detailed confessions, uncovered a shallow grave behind the cabin containing the skeletal remains of at least 3 infants. Dr. Henley's examination of the tiny bones revealed evidence of severe developmental abnormalities consistent with inbreeding, proving that Ezekiel and Naomi were not Delilah's first attempt at producing children through incest with her own son. The twins had lived their entire imprisoned existence knowing their younger siblings had been buried like unwanted animals when their deformities proved too severe even for Delilah's twisted religious justifications. Delilah's journal, once the twins helped investigators decode her personal cipher system, revealed the mathematical precision with which she had approached her abusive breeding program. Entry after entry documented her belief that each unsuccessful pregnancy brought her closer to producing the perfect marked children who would prove her family's divine selection. Her January 18, 71 entry, translated from cipher by Naomi's remarkable memory, read, "The Lord tests Abraham through Isaac, tests Job through suffering, tests our family through sacred union. Third attempt shows promise, though marks upon the flesh suggest further trials ahead." The clinical detachment with which she described her own children's deformities and calculated their usefulness revealed a mind that had completely divorced religious delusion from any remaining maternal instincts. The twins' confession expanded throughout February as they provided investigators with increasingly disturbing details about their methodical revenge planning. Ezekiel calmly explained how they had acquired anatomical knowledge by studying pages from their mother's midwife books, which she occasionally brought them during what she called education sessions, designed to prepare them for their eventual role as breeding stock for future generations. Their confession, recorded verbatim in Sheriff Whitlock's notes, included precise descriptions of how they had practiced cutting techniques on captured rabbits and birds, studying the exact pressure and angles needed to sever major arteries quickly and silently. They had spent 18 months perfecting their technique before attempting it on their parents, treating murder as a medical procedure that required extensive preparation and flawless execution. Evidence found throughout the property supported the twins' testimony about years of systematic abuse disguised as religious practice. Neighbor Ezra McCallum's expanded testimony revealed that the strange singing he had heard from the Thorne property during winter nights was actually the twins' coded conversations, which they had convinced their mother were religious seizures and speaking in tongues. McCallum's detailed statement, preserved in court records, described hearing rhythmic chanting that seemed to have patterns, like they were teaching each other something, but Delilah always said it was the Holy Spirit moving through her afflicted children. The twins had used their mother's religious delusions against her, creating a communication system that allowed them to plan murder while she believed she was witnessing divine miracles. Dr. Henley's medical analysis of the anatomical drawings found in the Corncrib revealed knowledge that should have been impossible for imprisoned teenagers to acquire. The drawings showed precise understanding of carotid artery placement, optimal cutting angles for maximum blood loss, and even basic principles of human anatomy that suggested formal medical training. His report, submitted to the Tennessee State Medical Board, concluded that the twins had somehow acquired knowledge equivalent to first-year medical students despite having no access to proper textbooks or instruction. The only explanation was their systematic study of their mother's midwife materials, combined with practical experimentation on small animals over a period of several years. Physical evidence discovered in February painted a complete picture of the twins' imprisoned existence and their methodical preparation for revenge. Hidden beneath their makeshift bedding, investigators found a collection of small animal bones that had been carefully cleaned and studied, forming a makeshift anatomical education system that the twins had used to understand bone structure, muscle attachment, and arterial placement. More disturbing still were detailed records scratched into the corncrib walls that documented every aspect of their parents' daily routines, sleeping patterns, and physical vulnerabilities. The twins had spent years observing their captors through gaps in the wooden walls, creating detailed intelligence profiles that would have impressed military strategists. Reverend Hutchins' testimony, recorded during February interviews, provided crucial context about Delilah's descent into religious extremism and her progressive isolation from normal community interaction. His statement revealed that Delilah had banned him from the property in 1880 after he questioned her increasingly radical biblical interpretations, particularly her claims that God required special sacrifice from chosen families. Hutchins testified that during their final conversation, Delilah had insisted that her family had achieved direct communion with the divine through practices that she refused to explain, but which gave her children marks of holy selection. His testimony established that community religious leaders had recognized Delilah's dangerous fanaticism years before her crimes were discovered, but had been unable to intervene due to the family's complete isolation. The scope of evidence collected by February's end revealed a multi-generational pattern of abuse that had escalated systematically over nearly 2 decades. Court records preserve Whitlock's final investigative summary, which documented how Delilah had transformed from a respected midwife into a calculating predator who used religious justification to abuse her own children while producing additional victims through incest. The twins' revenge, while brutal in its execution, represented the only form of justice available to victims who had been completely cut off from any outside intervention or legal protection. February 23, 1888, brought the twins' complete confession, a document so methodically detailed and emotionally detached that experienced investigators found themselves questioning their own understanding of justice and revenge. Sitting in Sheriff Whitlock's office, Ezekiel and Naomi calmly described their 3-year preparation for murder with the clinical precision of medical students discussing a surgical procedure. Their confession, transcribed verbatim by a court stenographer, revealed that they had treated their parents' deaths not as emotional revenge, but as a carefully planned medical operation designed to achieve maximum efficiency with minimal suffering for themselves. The twins' matter-of-fact recitation of anatomical details and timing calculations disturbed seasoned lawmen more than any emotional outburst could have achieved. Naomi's portion of the confession revealed the psychological manipulation that had made their escape and revenge possible. She described how they had studied their mother's behavioral patterns through gaps in the corncrib walls, learning to recognize the specific religious phrases and physical symptoms that would convince Delilah they were experiencing divine seizures. Their confession detailed 18 months of careful practice, during which they learned to coordinate their seizures perfectly, speaking in the coded language they had developed while appearing to babble in religious ecstasy. Naomi testified that the hardest part was not maintaining the deception, but controlling their excitement as the planned murder date approached, knowing that freedom was finally within reach. The twins' anatomical education had been far more sophisticated than anyone initially realized. Ezekiel's confession revealed that they had convinced their mother to bring them specific pages from her midwife books by claiming that studying medical texts was part of their divine calling to help other marked children in future generations. Over 2 years, they had acquired detailed knowledge of human circulatory systems, nerve placement, and the precise locations of major arteries, studying each page until they could reproduce anatomical diagrams from memory. Their confession included verbatim recitation of medical terminology that proved their self-education had achieved remarkable depth despite their isolation and youth. Physical evidence discovered in the Corncrib supported every aspect of the twins' confession with disturbing precision. Investigators found dozens of small bones from rabbits, squirrels, and birds that had been systematically dissected using sharp stones and metal fragments. Dr. Henley's analysis revealed that these bones showed cut marks consistent with anatomical study rather than food preparation, proving the twins had spent years practicing surgical techniques on captured animals. More chilling still were the detailed observational notes scratched into the wooden walls, documenting their parents' sleeping positions, movement patterns, and physical vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of military intelligence gathering. The confession revealed the exact sequence of events on the murder night with clinical detachment that horrified investigators. Ezekiel described how they had timed their fake seizures to coincide with their mother's evening prayer routine, knowing she would feel compelled to witness what she believed were divine manifestations. Once unchained, they had waited exactly 47 minutes for both parents to fall into deep sleep before moving to their beds with improvised cutting tools they had prepared months in advance. Naomi's testimony detailed how they had practiced the precise hand positions and cutting angles needed to sever carotid arteries simultaneously, ensuring both parents would lose consciousness within seconds and die within minutes without awakening or crying out. Medical expert testimony confirmed the surgical precision of the twins' execution. Dr. Henley's detailed analysis of the throat wounds revealed cuts made with anatomical knowledge that would have been impressive in a trained surgeon, let alone imprisoned teenagers. His report documented that both victims' carotid arteries had been severed at optimal angles for maximum blood flow, while secondary cuts had been made to ensure rapid death, even if the primary wounds had somehow failed. The doctor's testimony established that such precision could only have been achieved through extensive anatomical study and repeated practice, supporting the twins' confession about their years of preparation. Evidence of the twins' intelligence extended far beyond their anatomical knowledge. Sheriff Whitlock's investigation revealed that they had taught themselves to read using their mother's religious books, achieving literacy levels that surpassed many adults in their isolated mountain community. Their confession demonstrated sophisticated vocabulary and logical reasoning skills that had developed despite complete isolation from formal education. Most disturbing was their ability to manipulate their mother's religious delusions while maintaining perfect emotional control throughout years of abuse, suggesting psychological resilience and strategic thinking that bordered on the superhuman. The twins' final statements to investigators revealed their complete lack of remorse and their conviction that they had delivered righteous justice. Ezekiel calmly testified that they had corrected an imbalance that God and law had failed to address, while Naomi stated that their parents' deaths were necessary surgery to remove diseased tissue from the world. Their confession concluded with a chilling assessment of their situation. They had achieved their primary goal of ending their torment and exposing their parents' crimes, and they were prepared to accept whatever legal consequences followed. The twins' complete emotional detachment from their actions suggested that years of abuse had transformed them into something beyond normal human emotional response, creatures driven entirely by logic and the pursuit of justice through violence. Physical evidence linking the twins to the murders was overwhelming and irrefutable. Blood residue found under their fingernails matched both victims, while fabric fibers from their parents' nightclothes were discovered in the twins' makeshift bedding. Most damning was the discovery of the improvised cutting tools hidden in the corncrib, sharp metal fragments that perfectly matched the wound patterns found on both bodies. The evidence chain was so complete that the twins' guilt was never questioned. Only the moral and legal implications of punishing victims who had become killers through calculated revenge. March 15, 1888, marked the opening of what would become the most sensational trial in Tennessee legal history, as Ezekiel and Naomi Thorne stood before Judge Thaddeus Morrison to face murder charges that challenged every conventional understanding of victim and perpetrator. The twins' decision to represent themselves sent shockwaves through the legal community, as no one had anticipated that two physically deformed teenagers could possess the intellectual capacity to mount their own defense. Their opening statement, preserved verbatim in court transcripts, began with a chilling declaration that would define the entire proceedings. "We stand before this court not as murderers seeking mercy, but as instruments of justice delivering punishment that God and law had failed to provide." The packed courtroom fell silent as the twins calmly outlined their intention to prove that their parents' deaths were justified executions rather than criminal murders. Ezekiel's testimony over 3 days presented evidence with the methodical precision of an experienced prosecutor building a case against the deceased victims. He systematically detailed years of imprisonment, sexual abuse, and psychological torture, using Delilah's own journal entries to prove that their mother had deliberately produced children through incest while fully understanding the genetic consequences. His presentation included medical evidence of their deformities, documentation of their siblings' deaths, and testimony about the religious delusions that had justified their parents' crimes. Most disturbing was Ezekiel's clinical recitation of anatomical evidence proving sexual abuse, delivered with such detached professionalism that seasoned attorneys found themselves questioning who was really on trial. Naomi's testimony revealed the psychological warfare that had sustained them through 5 years of captivity while planning their methodical revenge. She presented detailed evidence of their parents' daily routines, behavioral patterns, and vulnerabilities, proving that their escape and murders had required intelligence and planning that contradicted any assumption of impaired mental capacity. Her testimony included verbatim recitation of conversations overheard through Corncrib walls, demonstrating perfect memory and analytical skills that impressed court observers and legal experts. Most compelling was her explanation of their coded communication system, which she demonstrated in court by speaking with Ezekiel in the complex language they had developed to coordinate their revenge, while convincing their mother they were experiencing religious seizures. The prosecution faced an unprecedented challenge in arguing for conviction against defendants who had systematically documented their parents' crimes with evidence more compelling than any prosecutor could have assembled. District Attorney Samuel Crawford's case relied on the legal principle that premeditated murder remained criminal regardless of motive, but his arguments were undermined by the twins' presentation of evidence showing years of systematic abuse that would have horrified any reasonable jury. Crawford's cross-examination revealed his discomfort with prosecuting victims whose crimes had exposed evil that the legal system had failed to detect or prevent. His closing argument, preserved in court records, acknowledged that justice, in this case, requires us to punish those who delivered the very justice we ourselves had failed to provide. Judge Morrison's jury instructions created legal precedent by addressing the unprecedented situation of victims who had become perpetrators through calculated revenge against their abusers. His guidance, documented in Tennessee legal archives, acknowledged that the twins' actions constituted premeditated murder while recognizing their unique circumstances as products of generational abuse that had transformed them into something beyond normal legal categories. Morrison's instructions required the jury to consider whether justice could be served by executing victims who had already delivered the punishment their parents deserved, creating a moral paradox that challenged fundamental assumptions about criminal justice and proportional punishment. The jury deliberated for 18 hours before reaching a verdict that satisfied neither traditional justice nor complete mercy. Their guilty verdict on murder charges was accompanied by an unprecedented recommendation for life imprisonment rather than execution, based on their conclusion that the twins were products of unspeakable evil who had corrected injustices that law and society had failed to address. The verdict, recorded in complete detail in Tennessee court archives, established legal precedent for considering victimization as a mitigating factor in capital cases, while maintaining that premeditated murder remained a criminal act regardless of justification or moral complexity. Sentencing on June 20th, 1888, brought Judge Morrison's final ruling that would define the case's legacy for decades. His sentence of life imprisonment rather than execution acknowledged the twins' victim status while maintaining that their calculated revenge constituted criminal behavior that required punishment. Morrison's sentencing statement, preserved in court records, declared that justice in this case requires punishment, tempered by recognition that these defendants achieved the very justice that our legal system had failed to provide. His ruling established that the twins would be transferred to Tennessee State Penitentiary, where they would serve their sentences under conditions far more humane than their childhood imprisonment. The twins' final years brought a form of justice that neither law nor revenge could have provided alone. Prison records document that both Ezekiel and Naomi lived with dignity and respect among fellow inmates, their intelligence and resilience earning them roles as teachers and counselors within the prison community. Ezekiel died of tuberculosis in 1891, having spent his final years teaching other inmates to read and write, while Naomi lived until 1923, becoming a skilled seamstress whose work was sought after even outside prison walls. Their transformation from tortured victims to respected community members proved that human